Hello everyone, I'm Daz and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK History, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is fellow reenactor and fellow Civil War buff and friend, I'm pleased to say, Chris Lean. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me on the show here, Darren. It's a real pleasure to finally be on here with you.
Excellent. And again, this is Chris's debut podcasting, and hopefully we'll have some more episodes in the future because he's very knowledgeable about the Civil War. So, Chris, before we start talking about our discussion today, which is the Trent Affair, the very British Trent Affair, which links Britain and American Civil War together. How did you first become interested in the American Civil War and history in general?
Well, great question there, Darren. I mean, history in general, I was always very interested in history when I was at school, but growing up during the 1980s, 1990s here in the UK, I'm sure you probably found it with history, where there always seemed to be this massive gap when we were studying it. So again, you always seem to go from ancient history where we're talking about Greeks and Romans and the Egyptians and people like that. And then suddenly we sort of jumped on and we're learning about Tudors and Stuarts. And then from that point, we suddenly seem to take a massive gap with perhaps just a little hint of the Victorian age in there. And suddenly we're in the First World War and Second World War. So the 19th century was like a massive gap in my knowledge when, in my formative years, when I got to the likes of university, etc. And I was under the impression, not very much happened there. The Napoleonic Wars were just something that went on. And I then, through work, through a friend, I got involved with the reenacting scene, got involved in the American Civil War. I didn't really know anything about the American Civil War. I knew there was a battle called Gettysburg, and apparently it was a big thing. But apart from that, I didn't really know much about it. And I went away, did some reading, because I didn't want to look like a bit of a novice when I was talking to the public at these events. And I found out that there was this real rich, diverse history around the mid-19th century and around the American Civil War, such characters and such interesting situations that it really kind of got me hooked from there on in.
Thank you, Chris. Excellent answer. And similar sort of story there. Growing up in that period of time. Great historical TV shows through the 90s and everything like that as well, like Sharp and all that sort
absolutely.
Of thing.
And everyone's addicted to the movie Gettysburg. Let's be honest, it's the greatest.
It is, certainly it is. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be discussing the Trent Affair. And the Trent Affair took place on November the 8th, 1861, right at the beginning of the American Civil War. So, Chris, what was the Trent Affair and why did it matter during the Civil War?
So the Trent Affair really, with the actual incident itself, it was a point where an American ship, the USS San Jacinto, basically fired upon and then boarded a British steamer, the Trent. And two Confederate commissionaires were basically captured and taken from the deck of the British ship. It was a massive international situation, and it caused a situation of brinksmanship between the British Empire and the United States, because neither side was really willing to back down over whether this taking of these Confederate commissionaires off the deck of the Trent considered basically almost an act of war between the two countries. So it really was a point where Britain and America were at the point where they were posturing to actually declare war on each other, and it could have completely unbalanced the situation during the Civil War because of it.
Excellent, thank you. And so again, what political and military conditions in late 1861 would lead up to it?
Well, there's a massive amount politically that's gone on up until this point. Again, trying to keep it brief. Obviously, you can look at the situation going all the way back to the War of 1812, where, again, America and Britain pretty much went over to the war of what American neutrality looks like. And again, that would come back to almost haunt the Americans again when we got to the situation at the start of 1861. But before that, we were in a situation where Britain and America were on a collision course, essentially, to have a bit of a situation between the two countries, with lots of border disputes going on during the 1840s and 1850s, the Oregon border dispute, the Canadian border dispute, and even as late as 1859, you have the Pig War on the island of San Juan, which is absolutely great, and we should make an episode about that sometime because it is hilarious, where Britain and America nearly went to war over the fact that one man killed another man's pig. But again, so the British and the Americans are sitting, and neither side are really willing to back down. But at the same time, they understand there's a really dangerous situation here where America probably has the land superiority, the armies that can actually overrun Canada, and at the same time the Royal Navy are in a situation where they can absolutely destroy the American Navy at this point in the American Civil War. So it could absolutely throw both countries into massive upheavals, and it will unbalance the balance of power there within the American continent. So leading into 1861, obviously we're in a situation where the South has seceded, and we're now moving into a situation where Robert Toombs, who's the acting Secretary of State at that point for the Confederate States of America, sends his commissionaires over to London. Now, initially they have a very, very strict guidelines of the things they're allowed to talk about when trying to get British recognition, international recognition for the Confederacy. And William Yancey is sent out initially to do this. And he's sent by Robert Toombs. He's given very strict instructions that he's only allowed to discuss the idea of the legality of the Confederate States leaving the Union, and also the fact of the idea of states' rights, the same principles that the Confederacy has been built on. What will then happen, moving on, is that when the shots are fired on Fort Sumter, that Britain will be in a position where they are speaking to these Confederate commissionaires. And initially, we require these two characters on the screen, so Slidell and Mason. They will be called upon to try and break a bit of a stalemate that's going on. What will happen is there will be a situation after the firing on Fort Sumter, May the 3rd, there will be an initial meeting between William Yancey with Lord Russell, who's the British foreign minister, and they will have a discussion regarding the international recognition of the Confederacy. Russell turns him away, essentially, because they're in a situation where he does not see this as being a major international event. The Confederacy have overrun Fort Sumter, that he will say that it is only an attempt to retake a fort which is already in Confederate-held territory, and that it doesn't constitute a major victory. Following this, Russell will then hold meetings with Prime Minister Palmerston, and Queen Victoria on the 13th of May will make a declaration of neutrality. This declaration of neutrality is probably the most unpopular thing for everyone possible at this point, except for perhaps the British interests. This declaration of neutrality angers the American government and the United States government, because ultimately it gives more legitimacy to the Confederacy than they want. It's saying that Britain will remain neutral between this war between two nations. Well, the United States government don't acknowledge that the Confederate government is a nation at this point. And so it's already giving more legitimacy to the Confederacy than the United States government want to have. Seward writes a famous letter on May the 21st to Russell, saying that ultimately this is setting a very dangerous precedent for the British Empire, that if the Confederacy is legally allowed to leave the United States, which they voluntarily joined in the first place, then what does it say for the British Empire, where countries have been forced to join that? Does it give them legal legitimacy to leave the British Empire? So he tries to act in a very malevolent kind of manner, trying to scare the British into not trying to accept this neutrality with the Confederate states. At the same time, the Confederate States are very upset because they want that international recognition, which they are not necessarily getting at this point from the Declaration of Neutrality. They're not getting the support, they're not getting the alliance that they're looking for, which is ultimately what they see as being the ultimate goal for them, to get their international recognition, just as it happened during the War of Independence. And then even other European powers, such as France, are being put in a situation where they're upset with this, because they thought that Britain would lead by actually trying to form an alliance with the Confederacy, and the likes of Napoleon III were looking to try and actually start building a new empire in America. So everyone came out of it very upset with the idea that the British were going to be neutral in all of this, because France had to follow that lead. What then happened was a short hiatus where Russell was trying to influence the Confederacy via Lord Lyons, who was the agent in the United States, trying to send envoys down to Charleston to actually get them to discuss with the Confederate government to actually join the Declaration of Paris of 1856, which would give international maritime law to support the Confederacy's cause. Again, the Declaration of Paris, the United States had not signed up to at this point. However, due to some spy actions, the international packages, the actual diplomatic packages that were moving back and forth, were intercepted. They were illegally opened by Union agents, and found that obviously there was word, which Russell was quoted as saying that this would give international legitimacy to the Confederacy if they supported the Declaration of Paris. However, Russell refused that and said that he had never said anything of the sort. No one was at liberty to use his name in that context. And it led to another one of Stuart's famous 26-page letters to Lord Russell, essentially telling him what he thought of him. Luckily enough, Lincoln did intervene, dulled down a lot of the dogmatic language in that letter, and rather than following Stuart's original orders that Charles Francis Adams, who was obviously the son of President John Quincy Adams, and also grandson of John Adams, he was ordered originally by Stuart that he should take that letter, place it in Russell's hand, and make sure that he read it in front of him. Lincoln, however, saw a better side of valor and said, you know what, probably better just paraphrase and read, bits that you believe to be important here. The summary of the letter was essentially that if the Confederate commissionaires continued to be received by Russell, that the American government would conceive the British as being an enemy of the United States. So, following up from the Battle of Bull Run, or Battle of Manassas, depending on your outlook on that, when the Confederate commissionaires requested a permission to meet with Lord Russell said that any communications that would be made with the Confederate commissionaires would have to be put in writing, and that he would not receive them. Following this, Yancey was taken very ill, and he was threatening to resign, and there was a real stalemate situation, which is where Slidell and Mason then come in, the two gentlemen we see on screen at the moment.
Excellent. And really good explanation there. Really, a
bit long-winded. Sorry.
Yeah, but it's a lot of information that's needed to sort of set the scene, politically. Yeah. Some of it I didn't actually know myself. Obviously, I knew that Seward was very anti-British. I did know that. Very much
Yeah, it's an interesting point with Stuart. At the start of the war, he was actually trying to petition that there should be an invasion of Canada in an effort to try and make the Confederacy rejoin the Union, because they would all band together based on a war declared in the Monroe Doctrine. So it's quite interesting when you see that kind of character, that he was very, very vehemently against European intervention in America at that point.
Yeah. And again, I'd like to. Obviously, I know you've got these two guys on the screen, but from what I understand, the North actually also sent envoys to Europe as well, didn't they? At some point.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, if you imagine, those envoys had a lot more legitimacy. As I say, Charles Francis Adams was the head of the American litigation in London. So again, as I say, he had quite a vast background. Obviously, two presidents for his grandfather and his father, and he was there essentially acting as the voice of the American government in London. And likewise, in similar circumstances, you then had the American litigation in Washington, D.C., which was led by Lord Lyons, who was now let me just see, he's got a great job title. He's not the ambassador, because it wasn't technically an embassy, it was a litigation. So he was the minister plenipotentiary. What a great job title.
Wow, yeah, that is okay. Thanks, Chris, for explaining all that. So
That's all
anyway,
right.
again, we've got these two guys on the screen now. Who were James Mason and who were John Slidell? Just give us a little bit of an idea of who they are.
So James Mason and John Slidell, they were basically now assigned by the new Secretary of State, Secretary of State Hunter. He saw that there was a real situation brewing here. The British were obviously not receiving Yancey as the commissioner, and he realized that the information and the instructions that were given were very, very brief at best and very concrete. So these commissioners were sent to try and break that situation. So with the two gentlemen, so James Mason was a senator from Virginia. He was actually the head, prior to the Civil War, of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. So he was actually had a lot of pedigree there of actually dealing with international situations, and was aware of a lot of foreign politics that were going on. And then at the same time, you had John Slidell, who was from Louisiana. He was actually President Polk's chief negotiator during and before the Mexican War. So again, he was part of the negotiating team that was responsible for negotiating that huge trench of land after the settlement of the Mexican War. So he was the guy responsible for getting New Mexico and California for the United States. He was part of that purchasing agreement there. So these guys had a huge pedigree of dealing with international relations. And again, these are the guys that are going to turn it around for the Confederacy, at least from Hunter's point of view. So again, they're going to go over there, and they're given a much broader idea of how they can communicate with the British government and try and get that international recognition. It's not just the British government as well. I believe Mason was assigned to London. Slidell was actually assigned to Paris. And again, they're being given all kinds of communications that to say, look, you can negotiate, you can talk about things like slavery, because it will be an important issue. You can't just skirt over it. We will be looking at things like the self-imposed King Cotton policy there, where again, we're going to try and withhold this. This isn't from the Confederate government, but you know what? The Confederate people have spoken here. It's also talking about ideas that ultimately, by supporting the Confederacy, that ultimately it's supporting Britain's interests in North America with the Dominion of Canada there, because it means that a weakened United States are not going to have such bargaining power when it comes to trying to deal with the international situation and deal with border disputes. So ultimately, they're trying to negotiate with every tool they've got available now. So it's actually making the situation a lot stronger for these guys, these commissioners, once they get to London and to Paris. But obviously, the first problem is they need to get them there, which probably brings us on nicely to the next step, I think.
Yeah, so excellent. Well, brilliant explanation there. And again, as you said, their main aim is to get that recognition from Britain and France, the superpowers of the time. Okay, so like you said, let's talk about the incident. So what happened aboard the USS San Jacinto and the British mail steamer, the Trent? Sorry if I butchered that.
No, San Jacinto's fine, mate. It's actually named after the Battle of San Jacinto, which was part of the Texas Uprising. So immediately after the aftermath of the Alamo. So yeah, what initially, as we say, the first major problem is these commissionaires. They're in the South now. Originally, when Yancey and the initial commissionaires were sent over, they were sent over before there was a Union blockade. Now there is a Union blockade. It's not the greatest blockade in the world at this point in the war. Remember, it's still the first 6 months of the war. However, we have a problem that we need to get these guys from Charleston to London. How does the Confederacy go about that? So initially, the first thought process was to put them all aboard the CSS Nashville and send them off that way. But the problem with the Nashville is it has a very, very deep draft. It means the only way it can leave Charleston Harbor is to go out the main channel, which is exactly where the Union blockade is waiting for them. So the safer option that's put forward is that a private captain comes to them and offers his ship, the Gordon, to try and convey these commissionaires out of Charleston Harbor. Now, he actually makes one or two offers. He says you can either buy this ship outright for 62,000 Confederate dollars, or you can charter the ship for 10,000 Confederate dollars. The Confederacy doesn't have that money at this point in the war. They need every penny they can get. So a private citizen actually charters the ship and offers to convey the commissionaires out. So the Gordon, now renamed the Theodora, I believe, slips out through one of the back channels of Charleston Harbor and sets sail. It set sail on the 12th of October. Now, obviously, it's naive to think that there wasn't any spy activity going on. And so it was very publicly known, the plan that these commissionaires were going to have to get out of the South some way. And everyone believed that they were leaving aboard the Nashville. So when the Theodora actually left on the 12th of October, everyone was actually looking for the Nashville. So Theodora arrives in Nassau in the Bahamas, but however, they arrived a day late and they missed the connecting steamer to take the commissionaires to St. Thomas being the door to the Caribbean. So essentially, they missed their ship. And so they're in a position where they have to try and find alternate transport. The Theodora then sets off into the Spanish territory there, and October the 15th comes across a Spanish warship, which actually tells them that the RMS Trent, the mail steamer, is due in Havana in about 3 weeks' time. So from there, they then sail down to Cuba, and they arrive at Cardenas, I believe. I must check my spelling. Yes, Cardenas, on October the 16th. They find out the date that the Trent is due to leave, and they proceed overland at that point. Meanwhile, as we said, we're still in the situation where everyone's looking for the Nashville right now, assuming that these commissionaires are on board. And so you're in a position where actually, ironically, on October the 15th, the day before the commissionaires arrive in Cuba, that a separate ship, the USS James Adger, is actually sent to try and intercept the Nashville. And it arrives in Southampton trying to intercept it. Well before the Nashville turns up on the 21st of November. However, the real irony was, at this point, everyone internationally is expecting these commissionaires to be aboard on the deck of the Nashville when it arrives in the UK. But when it arrives, they're not there. So everyone, massive search is on trying to find where the commissionaires have gone, and they're in Cuba. So this is where the San Jacinto comes in, and I think you had a lovely picture of Charles Wilkes on the next slide there.
There we go.
There we are. So this is where Captain Charles Wilkes comes in of the USS San Jacinto. So Charles Wilkes is actually quite celebrated captain prior to the Civil War. He's actually quite famous for leading an expedition to chart a lot of the American coastline during the 1840s, which doesn't sound like it's a very exciting prospect, but we're looking at a time before the Mexican War. So again, a lot of the western seaboard has not been charted. He's checking out this. He goes to the Antarctic. He actually names a part of the Antarctic Wilkes Land not after himself, because he's not that vain. Instead, he names it after his expedition, which is called the Wilkes Expedition. So again, you get the kind of idea of his character there. He's a very kind of vainglorious kind of guy. He's as natured, he's seen as being a very, very insubordinate person. And what is often said about him after the Wilkes expedition, that he tried to court-martial almost every single officer in the expedition because Wilkes was right and everyone else had to be wrong. So Wilkes is in a position where San Jacinto, he's off of the coast of Africa searching for Confederate commerce raiders. And what will happen is that he's then sent orders to go to St. Thomas. He arrives there on October the 13th, and he's been sent there to join an attack on Port Royal. When he arrives in St. Thomas, he actually finds out that the CSS Sumter, a commerce raider, has actually been attacking shipping off of Cuba, off of a place called Cienfuego. And so he will then try and send his ship down to intercept that commerce raider, despite the fact it's been missing for about 2 weeks by this point. But he's out to try and build his own reputation. He's trying to make a name for himself in the Civil War, just as he did beforehand with the Wilkes expedition. So he sails down to Cuba. He gets to Cienfuego. He doesn't find this ship. He docks. He reads a local newspaper and finds out that Slidell and Mason are there in Cuba and that they're going to be boarding the RMS Trent on the, I've got to get this right now, the actual date, but they're going to be boarding the Trent on the 7th of November, leaving from Havana. So Wilkes convenes a meeting with his first officer and says that he intends to take these commissionaires from the deck of the Trent. They have a discussion to decide the legality of whether they can do this. And one of the things they decide is if they define that these commissionaires are contraband of war, a phrase that we hear thrown about a lot during the American Civil War, let's be honest, in a completely different context. But if they consider these commissionaires to be contraband of war, then they're perfectly legal to do so. And this is where, again, Wilkes' knowledge, where he's done a lot of charting of those oceans and the seas around the American coastline, comes in. He notes that there is a perfect opportunity to intercept the Trent at the Bahama Channel, because it's the only deep water channel that leads from Havana to St. Thomas, which is going to be the next stop. And so it will lead to this situation where he is in a position to intercept the Trent and take the commissionaires.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Yeah, so, and again, even though it's a neutral British vessel, they feel like they can legally do this. Is it international waters that this incident takes place?
Yeah, absolutely. It's in international waters. This is a British ship under a declaration of neutrality. And this is the same thing where it would undermine a lot of the arguments that would follow, because this is the same neutrality that the Americans were protesting for during the War of 1812, ironically. So it almost undermined their own argument when there was going to be a diplomatic situation leading to what happened with the boarding of the Trent.
Mm-hmm. And again, how does Captain Wilkes's action align or clash with international law at that point as well?
So this is where we sort of align with what was being said with the Declaration of Paris of 1856. So under that Declaration of Paris, there was three major considerations. Number one, all the member states had to prove that any blockades that they were producing would have to have been effective. And this was one of the reasons why Russell was pushing the Confederacy to join it, because ultimately the Union would have to quantify that their blockade was effective. which arguably it wasn't. The second step was that member states couldn't actually send commerce raiders after each other, so privateers would not be able to essentially go after each other's cargoes. And then the last thing, and this is the point where it really starts to become a matter of contention, that member states, if they were boarding another ship, they could take it if there was contraband of war on board, which is where this idea of contraband comes from. But at the same time, it would be subject to a prize court. And that is something which plays a lot into what happens politically after the situation.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Great. Yeah. Okay. And again, what, during wars, there are, they use the excuse, like you said, contraband or a war measure. I suppose it's a similar sort of situation.
Absolutely.
So how did the Americans respond to the capture, of Mason and Slidell once they learn about it? Because again, if you said they're down near Cuba, it's going to take some time for that news to filter up to Washington, isn't it?
Absolutely, it does. So what happens is the boarding of the Trent takes place. So initially, the San Jacinto is laying in wait for the Trent, and it all happens on, I believe, the 8th of November. 2 shots are fired. One shot as a warning shot initially, which the captain of the Trent takes absolutely no notice of and thinks it's some kind of practice that's going on. And then a second shot is fired off the bow of the Trent. At that point, they drop colours and a boarding party comes aboard from the San Jacinto. Now, initially, the first officer is sent aboard with orders from Wilkes, and the orders are to go aboard to find the commissionaires. If the commissionaires are found on board, that the ship should be taken as a prize of war and taken back to an American port. And at the same time, to search the ship for any evidence of the Confederacy's intent. So searching for any diplomatic packages or anything that's any paper that's been headed by the Confederacy. So the first officer goes aboard. Obviously, the captain deplores the action and tries to throw the Americans off his ship. The lieutenant who goes aboard is very realized at the moment how serious this matter has become right now, that this could actually cause a war with Britain. He wasn't actually expecting that Wilkes would actually follow through on his actions of actually trying to board this ship. So he tries to tread very carefully. He asks for the commissionaires to come forth, which they do. Yeah. And they are then taken aboard the cutters and sent back to the San Jacinto. Now, against Wilkes's orders, they do not take the ship as a prize ship. They do not try and search the vessel for any kind of evidence of the Confederate intentions. Instead, they come back with the commissionaires because of that. Now, ironically, those actions are what causes the discrepancy in the legality of the action. He doesn't want to take that ship, and he goes back to Wilkes and says practically that there's no point in trying to take the Trent because there's already a very small crew on the San Jacinto. Practically trying to take the ship back as a prize ship is going to leave the ship dangerously short of people if they don't come across any kind of action. So he tries to justify his actions that way. So Slidell and Mason are taken. They're taken to prison and they are held in initially at Hampton Roads. So the San Jacinto arrives on the 15th of November. So a week later, it takes them to get to Hampton Roads. And from there, they are then held. The news spreads throughout the United States. In actual fact, the press gets hold of it much before the government is aware of this. And Wilkes is praised as a hero. He is given all the plaudits and adulation. He is invited to all the best parties and all the best circles because of the service he has done for the Union, exposing the British for the traitorous dogs that they were because they were harboring these Confederate commissionaires. So again, this is really, pandering to the masses at this point. Everyone sees Wilkes as a hero. The Union government get hold of this, and some people are absolutely and utterly mortified. I know Gideon Wells was absolutely deploring of the actions that happened. Lincoln, unfortunately, was in the position where, because the people were aware of this, he couldn't actually turn around and say that he thought this was wrong and potentially the actions were illegal, because by the point the public has seen Wilkes as a hero, and he's been given public medals for the great service that he's done to the Union right now. So again, in actual fact, the press got hold of this much before the actual, before it got to Washington.
Excellent. And again, it's like it could have been a tinderbox the way you explained it. Because again, if they had taken that ship as a prize, that is 100% a war, an act of war, surely.
Well,
You know?
the interesting thing is, there's two arguments, because we'll never know, because obviously hindsight is a beautiful thing. But ultimately, by taking the ship, it legally actually could have set a much stronger precedent than actually just taking Slidell and Mason off of the deck as they did. Because essentially what would happen there would be legal arguments based around, was this essentially a legalized kidnapping that took place? Or would it have actually just been better if they'd just taken the whole damn ship with them on the deck, which would actually have been more legitimate under maritime law?
Yeah. And again, at the end of the day, like you said, they were supposed to be on another vessel. They didn't make it. So they've made plans to, go on the Trent. So people back in London probably don't know anything about this, the fact that they're having to sort, or whether they know they didn't make it, but they probably don't know that they've even boarded the Trent at this point. No. And so, it's the government's, and like you said, the American government don't know nothing about it either. It's just somebody's just acted on what they think is probably the best way to handle this situation from intel that they've got. But again, this could have blown up into something absolutely huge, and I didn't realise how huge it could have been.
It's the slowest game of brinksmanship you've seen in your life, basically, because half the actions people don't know about until they've already happened. We're talking about this, they arrived, or they were brought to Hampton Roads on the 15th of November. Take into account, we're still in a position where the Nashville is still at sea, and everyone thinks they're aboard the Nashville right now. So by the time the Nashville turns up, they're already actually being held. So it's really a kind of a real slow burn situation, which is why when you look at this all happens, in early November, and ultimately the real political implications of this don't take place until late December, because it's taking time for the information to pass back and forth over the Atlantic while this is going on. In the UK, they didn't know about the fact that obviously what had happened with the Trent until the 27th of November, nearly 2 weeks, 3 weeks, in fact, after the actual boarding took place. So again, this is all taking place where actions are overlapping. By the time someone's actually done an action, people are responding to it weeks later and reacting to that at the point that something else has already happened on the other side of the Atlantic.
So interesting, really is. Very, very interesting topic. So I'd love to know what their reaction was, Mason and Slidell, to being taken aboard. Is there any written documents of or from their diaries or whatever that they've put in about the incident themselves and how they reacted to being arrested and taken aboard the San Jacinto?
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not too sure about if there's any personal accounts there of that, or at least not to my knowledge immediately. But one of the things that is really, really great is the Confederate reaction when they find out about this happening. Jefferson Davis actually makes a comment and says that it doesn't matter that this happened on a British ship right now. They could have easily just have been lifted from Piccadilly, as far as he was concerned, because those men were under the protection of the British government because they were under a British flag at that time. So again, this causes major friction and major embarrassment for the British government, because they're now looking like they're powerless to stop the Americans, or so the Americans think. And at the same time, there's a very converse view where the British are sitting there looking at the situation and turning around and saying, the Americans are absolutely out of control right now. They're starting to board neutral ships in an effort to try and find private citizens from people they believe to be their enemy. But at the same time, they don't want to acknowledge the fact that they're a warring nation against them. So it's really kind of this very open diplomatic situation where everyone's literally up in arms about the situation that's that's unfolding right now.
Okay, and again, obviously, we know they're taking off this British ship, but as you said, one of the guys is actually heading to Paris. And, so France is a different animal at that point as well. They're under control, as you said, by Napoleon III, who has ambitions, quite a lot of ambitions of territory. His name says it all, and I do believe they even put a puppet government in Mexico during that time. But
1863, Battle of Puebla, etc. Yeah, of course.
What is Europe? What is Europe's reaction to this unfolding situation when they learn about this?
So initially, there are rumours that actually reach Britain about this before it actually becomes official knowledge on the 27th November. Palmerston actually goes and consults some of the top legal minds in the UK to actually say, rhetorically speaking, if this was to happen, is it legal? To which they sort of weren't able to give a really conclusive answer. But once the news actually comes in of the incident that happened, it was given that, again, the actions that as they happened were not legal because they lifted the commissionaires, who were private citizens, off the deck of this ship. They were essentially being kidnapped. They were being taken against their will. And if the ship itself, if instead that the crew had gone aboard from the San Jacinto, found documents from the Confederate government, and there were documents. There was actually an attaché case, which was not found initially because it was actually being looked after by a Royal Navy officer who was aboard the ship at the time. So again, the Royal Naval commander actually took these dispatches and protected them. If they had found those dispatches, they would have been at liberty to have taken that ship as a prize of war and taken it back for an international prize court to have decided if this action was legal. But because there was no prize court that happened, the action was seen internationally as a crime. It was illegal. There was no prize court to decide whether this was a legal boarding action. There was no international committee to decide whether this was legal action. So because of that lack of having the prize court that happened, there was quite a lot of friction that happened based off of it. Palmerston famously walked into a cabinet meeting, threw his hat down on the floor, and actually said, I don't know if you men are going to stand for this, but I are, and I'm not by thunder. It was absolutely going to explode. This was a powder keg at this point. But Britain was very much leading the way at this point. France and England, they were in close cahoots, obviously, since the Crimean War. And so France was going to actually follow Britain's lead. But at the same time, they wanted Britain to intervene because it would give the opening for their potential imperialistic ambitions to be realized.
Yeah. And it's so good, so interesting. Really is. Okay, let's talk about Mr. Abraham Lincoln and how he's going to try and diffuse this situation. Because, again, I think he's quoted as saying one war at a time, doesn't he? So, he doesn't want war with Britain, does he?
Yeah, so again, as I say, this is the slowest game of brinksmanship that's taking place throughout December time. Letters are being sent back and forth across the Atlantic. Or in actual fact, it's almost very one-sided initially. Russell is sending a lot of letters over to the United States government. petitioning them to release the commissionaires, to make a formal apology to the United Kingdom, to the British government for boarding this ship, and also trying to find out if Wilkes was responsible for this himself, or was he acting under orders from the government? Because again, they were trying to work out, was he actually working under orders? Was this intentional that this happened? And consistently, that letter was not being responded to. It wasn't actually being replied to, and it led to the British Empire moving up to a stage of war footing. During the December time, over 11,000 troops were actually moved to Canada. I believe it works out somewhere in the region of about 5 battalions of men, of British regular soldiers, were sent to bolster the Canadian troops that were already on standby. There was also another 28,500 men which were actually put at the ready to sail at a day's notice. Plans were being drawn up for the invasion of the United States through Maine and into Massachusetts. The Royal Navy was starting to actually prepare preparations for the blockading of northern ports and actually start bombardment of major northern harbors such as Boston and New York. This was during the December. This was getting to the point where this was actually getting serious. This was going to happen. However, in the government in the United States, Lincoln was trying to offer a more moderate approach, as he was so famously for doing, saying, look, we shouldn't actually, I'm going to take this stand with my feet in midair. We aren't going to do anything about this right now. We're certainly not going to release this commissionaires right now, but at the same time, we're not going to start sending apologies to the British Empire. However, what will happen towards the end of December, the French foreign minister in Washington actually will come to Stuart and actually tell him, you do realize the British have actually started deploying their forces and they're preparing for an invasion. At which point they suddenly realize this has got serious now. This has gone too far. And what then happens is, as you say, Lincoln makes his famous announcement, one war at a time. Slidell and Mason end up being released on the 1st of January. At the same time, a letter is sent back to the British government. There is no apology. There is no confirmation. There is just simply the acknowledgement that the commissionaires will be released, and also that Wilkes was acting without the authority of the United States government. However, during a cabinet meeting on the 25th of December, I'll read this out verbatim because I quite like this quote. So this is Charles Francis Adams. So on the 25th of December, on Christmas Day, in a cabinet meeting, he read the letter. The passions of the country are up, and a collision is inevitable if the government of the United States should, before the news reaches the other side, have assumed the position of Captain Wilkes in a manner to preclude the possibility of explanation. Ministers and people now believe fully the intention of the U.S. government to try and drive the Americans to hostilities. The U.S. government to drive Britain to hostilities. So again, people realized this was getting serious now. This was going to actually get to the point where this was going to go to war, and it could have had massive, massive implications on the United States moving forwards. So Lincoln chooses the moderate approach, quietly releases the commissionaires, says no more about it, and he makes this famous quote of one war at a time, because he has a civil war to concentrate on, not a war with Britain.
Yes, brilliant. And again, Palmerston and Russell are very influential in their roles that they play, like you said, in getting this situation, sorted out.
Yeah, no, this is it. They are very involved. And again, as I say, it's a classic game of brinksmanship here. Ultimately, neither side wants to back down. Neither side wants to show themselves to be weak in the face of the others. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to show affront, but at the same time, not try to show that weakness, but also not be the aggressor in any upcoming hostility, which, let's be honest, is very much what we see at the start of the Civil War with the firing on Fort Sumter. No one wants to be the ones to fire those first shots because they're the ones that will be blamed for starting the war. So again, they try to take this moderate approach. And luckily enough, after the release of the commissioners, even though Britain doesn't get what it wants, it doesn't get its apology. The situation diffuses itself in time.
Mm-hmm. And again, so that's what I was going to ask now. How did the affair affect US-British relation afterwards?
So again, it's probably one of those situations where I draw a lot of conclusions with, and a lot of comparisons with later wars. When you look at the likes of, say, the Cold War, this is the Cold War happening like a century earlier. We're in a situation where they came to the brink of this situation, which could have ended up being a war. It could have had massive implications. It could have had massive implications for the Confederacy because obviously it could have completely changed the face of the war. Had the United States suddenly been faced with a situation where they had a war on two fronts, a war with the Confederacy in the south and potentially with the United Kingdom in there invading from Canada in the north. So ultimately, there we start to see this this warming of the tensions, that there's not this situation where it's coming to this idea of brinksmanship. And again, despite the fact that there is a frosty reception between the two nations, in reality, they're stronger because of it, because they understand that their actions have the ability to completely destabilize the balance of power in America. So it's in their interest to make sure that they communicate. And ultimately, it leads to much better friendship between the United States and the British government moving forward into the end of the 19th century and then into the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it would have brought this situation, as you said, it sort of sorts itself out, but do you think it brought closer recognition of the Confederacy from the British government? Because as we know, in 62, they are discussing this in Parliament, that recognition element to, recognising the Confederate States.
Absolutely, it did. We were in a situation at that point where this situation could have blown up at any time, and at the same time, it increases the legitimacy of the Confederacy because through the actions of the United States, or through more specifically the actions of Wilkes, it shows almost vilifies the arguments and vindicates what they've been saying, that the United States are a foreign power and they're trying to exert their influence over the Confederacy. Britain gets a taste of this at that point, and it almost tries to reinforce that argument. So it actually, to some extent, pushes Britain and the Confederacy a little bit closer together. And there's still those talks about the international recognition, and it will take a major, major victory to actually get that international recognition, which is what ultimately leads to the likes of the Maryland campaign and eventually the Gettysburg campaign. But yeah, and again, if it had have happened, it would have changed the face of the war, as I said, potentially with the Confederacy and the British. If there had have been the war there between the British and the Americans, there could have been an alliance in that respect. Again, it's a what if question, but I think it is the enemy of my enemy is my friend, to be honest. If the Confederacy and the Great Britain are both waging war on America, it will be in their interests to actually form an alliance at that point. But again, it's one of the great historical what if questions that history is made up of.
Mm-hmm. And again, I mean, we say that Britain wasn't involved in the war afterwards or anything like that, but we know that's not the truth. I mean,
that's the greatest fallacy of all time.
Yeah. I mean, the shipbuilding in Liverpool, and again, I did a episode recently about the Shenandoah, and as we know, as I learned from that episode, the US actually sued Britain afterwards.
And it took, and I believe, until the 1970s to repay the reparations, I believe, off the top of my head. Yeah, no, absolutely. This is the thing. It's that declaration of neutrality that was made on the 13th of May, 1861. It is such an open term, because in reality, as we say, it gave more legitimacy to the Confederacy than the United States wanted them to have. And as well, it was probably one of the best ways that Britain could have supported the Confederacy without actually supporting them, because they're in this position where Confederate ships can call in at British ports, because, again, they're neutral right now. Same as United States ships can call in at British ports because they're neutral. And the same thing goes when they were looking for the Nashville after it had disappeared. The Royal Navy was put on high alert when the James Archer actually turned up in Southampton, because they were so concerned that a United States ship might fire on a Confederate ship in British waters. They did not want to get dragged into a war between the Confederacy and the Union. Not yet. But at the same time, that Declaration of Neutrality, it allowed for private citizens to make private sales to other private citizens. So you have the industry of like Birmingham Small Arms, where they will sell Enfield rifles by the thousands to both sides during the war, because they're being purchased by private agents working on behalf of the United States government or the Confederate States government. Same with the shipping. As long as we're not selling a designated warship right now, we can sell whatever the hell we want to either side, and it does not matter. And the irony was, it was almost, cocking a bit of a snook to the United States, because during the War of 1812, that's exactly what the United States were doing between Britain and France during the Napoleonic Wars. They were selling ships to the French to actually use against the Royal Navy. So it was kind of getting our own back in that respect. It was really a bit of a mean thing to do to the United States, but in reality, it was probably the wisest action at that time.
Yeah, excellent. Brilliant. What a very interesting period politically, and it's very interesting. Okay, so how is the Trent Affair remembered today? A blunder, escape, or a diplomatic success? And this is my last sort of question.
That's a really, really interesting one. So I think, to be honest, it's a bit of all three, if I'm honest. From the perspective of Wilkes, perhaps it was a blunder. That he didn't try and get confirmation of those orders before he tried to take those actions. And again, that would have been the logical thing to have tried to have done. But had he have done that, he may have missed his opportunity before he got a receipt of that order to actually see if the government backed his actions there. It was a near miss, most definitely. But ultimately, I like to think of it, as I've used the term many times during this episode, it was a game of brinksmanship, with no side willing to back down, and every side had everything to prove. And ultimately, it was probably that nearest point that Britain came to intervene in the Civil War, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Have you got any good book recommendations for this event that takes place, Chris?
I absolutely love The World on Fire. It's a fantastic book about both the British and American politics and the foreign policies going on, and that's written by a lady named Amanda Foreman. Really, really, really great book. It's a mammoth read. It's like over 1,000 pages long. Wow. I actually, believe it or not, sitting about a foot away from me, I have my copy right here. Nice. As it's been leafed through very well in preparation for this episode. But yeah, absolutely great book. Recommend it to anyone, that one.
Well, Chris, honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure talking about this subject with you, as well as we've been talking about doing something together for a long, long time. And it's fantastic. And I will say, ladies and gentlemen, that Chris is very knowledgeable about Mr. Tardy George Sykes. So in the future, we're hoping and planning an episode on Mr. Sykes, because he is obviously, because we're in the 4th US Infantry reenactment group, and of course he would have been the commander of that brigade at the time.
Yeah.
So.
I've got the Bible ready for that one here. I've got my copy of Timothy J. Reese to talk all about Sykes ready for that episode, Daz. So it'll be an absolute pleasure.
Regulars. But all there's left to say, Chris, is cheers.
Cheers. Look after yourself, buddy.